Hello again. This is the second part on my presentation on the chapter How Do We Learn Grammar by Quirk and Stein. Something I forgot to acknowledge before was that I took the definition of what a lexeme is from the Tulio's Manual de l'Español 2010. It's actually Manual de Gramática del Español by Tulio. Okay, so going back to where we left off in the first video, here. So we can use nonsense to set up hypotheses as to how we learn the role of parts of speech and parts of sentences. We're going to use nonsense following Quirk and Stein now. So if we have this, sentence reading, Plom the plikvol Croatian will be ruggling Polanians anglishably in the writ. Right, every word falls into some sort of pattern that is recognizably English, although this is not an English sentence, because there's more to us considering this an English sentence than simply understanding that each one of the words that make it up fall into some sort of pattern that we recognize as English-like. We still do. We still think that Plom is okay where it is, that the plikvol Croatian is okay where it is, that its formation is, abiding by some rule of English that we may not be able to explain, but still know intuitively that it exists. Will be ruggling still, following a pattern that we have come across, many times before, taking a look at this sentence, so on and so forth, right? So what we're dealing with here is two types of relations: paradigmatic relations and syntagmatic relations. These, relations were explained first by Ferdinand de Saussure, right? The Swiss linguist that you all studied about, I presume, when doing Spanish, right? In second year or first year. In any case, we owe this distinction to him. So paradigmatic relations pertain to the relations that exist between elements that may appear, in the same place, in the same slot in the sentence, but are not actually used in the sentence that we are considering. So going back to this, nonsensical sentence that we're using to prove how is it that parts of speech and parts of sentences work in English. Plom is paradigmatically related to any other option that we would accept as an alternative here. So instead of Plom, we could have, and I'm going to where Quirk and Stein produce these examples, we could have, instead of Plom, some equivalent words such as, thinking of a proper noun, Isabel, right? Or Kathy, or Tom, right? Because there's something linking together Plom, Isabel, and Kathy, and this relationship that there exists between these three variants, these three options that I am putting forth, is connected to this sort of relations, paradigmatic one. All right? So it is the relations that exist between elements that may appear in the same slot, in the same place, in a given sentence. Now, syntagmatic relations are the relations that are established in between the actual words employed in a sentence. So the actual members of this chain, right? So plum is related to the plicful quotation, and in turn, within the plicful quotation, they are related in a grammatical way, for the precedes plicful and the plicful precedes quotation, right? Now, what we have here is explanation. Writ is used in two here. So this is the sentence that we are considering. Plum, the plicful quotation will be Raglan Polanians Anglishably in the writ. This is sentence 2, going by the author's chapter that we're focusing on. And writ here, in the writ, is used in the framework where words like office, but not then, frequently appear and make sense. Right, because we can have Plum is doing this in the office. So this is paradigmatically related to office, because this could be an option. Instead of writ, we could have office here. We can say and make sense in the office, right? But is not related paradigmatically to a word like then, because we cannot have in the then. What we could have instead is replacing in the writ, this whole phrase, for a word like then, here, then, but not to mean place or location, but rather to mean time, a temporal value. When will Plum, the plicful quotation, be Raglan Polanians Anglishably? Then. Okay, moving on. So it must be noted that the arrangements display not just the structure but structures, because, as we were making reference to before, there's this, the plicful quotation, which is a subunit of this sentence, and this subunit in itself is following a structure of its own. So quotation is the most important word that allows for the existence of this type of specifier and allows for the existence of this type of modifier. And considering the language that we think this nonsensical sentence may belong to, this modifier is grammatically placed pre-nominally or pre-head, in its pre-head position, right? So there is a system of rules and structures not just at play in the general sentence, but also in the subparts, in the constitutive elements that this sentence is made up of. English has structures within structures. The same happens in Spanish. There's a grammar within words as well as between words. Yes, there is. So, suddenly the fine horse will be facing pinnacles shyly in the field. right? Recently, the square horse will be reading buses darkly in the sea. What is at stake here? It is actually a great deal more difficult to invent the studiously impossible for A than it is to invent for. Why? Because this one doesn't make sense. For A doesn't make sense. So that's why, although we may see there's something grammatical in it, there's something that could allow us to determine that this could be English, it's difficult to produce it, for it makes no sense. And we can use the sentence that was, created by Chomsky. This is section Making Sense, page 180 in the chapter we're discussing. The sentence that reads, "Colorless green ideas leap furiously," in the same line as for A is. And this is a sentence that was created by Chomsky in his book Syntactic Structures in 1957. And with this sentence he wanted to exemplify that a sentence may be grammatically correct but still make no sense, still be nonsensical. So the point that he was trying to make was that there is, a distinction between syntax and semantics that ought to be acknowledged. But there's also an interplay of these two, modules, of these two systems, syntactic and semantic. And that we cannot dispense with one even when the other is grammatical. The two ought to be at play for us to have a sentence, a grammatical, meaning possible sentence in any language. So this seems to suggest that making sense comes first in our linguistic priorities, or at least that we are working with two, levels. The one of making sense, having to do with meaning, having to do with the semantics of what we say, and then the arrangement, of elements in sentences so that we get our meanings across. It's like the two at the same time. We're prepared to accept grammatical or lexical deviance provided we can guess the intended meaning, is the conclusion. So we can understand this sentence, although it is grammatically deviant and lexically deviant too, for there's no such thing as things, right? But provided that we have, just as this conclusion postulates, that we can guess the meaning intended, then we accept it, although it may be grammatically or lexically deviant. So however it is that we learn grammar, it must be accompanied simultaneously with learning the meanings of words and having the ability to make sense with both. So remember this notion of the meaning of words and how important the meaning of specific words such as verbs is. Going back to Cook's chapter and the usage of the verb faint and the information that this verb comes with, in this mental dictionary, this lexicon that we are believed to have. We have to know what faint means so that we're able to use it correctly in grammatical sentences, possible sentences in English. We can have a person fainting, but not a rock, nor can a person faint another person. Clear? So it's different, types of knowledge at work simultaneously. I loves to hear him sing because he never gives us nothing that's low. very comprehensible, completely grammatical in the sense of possible, in one of the varieties of English, not the standard variety, but a different variety. And here is the moment when we acknowledge the importance of, recognizing the usefulness of managing ourselves with the standard variety of our language, but at the same time, giving credit, valuing, giving importance, as much importance to the other varieties that exist in our language that are as grammatical, as systematic as the variety that is considered standard. Systematic in the sense of producing the same patterns over and over, right? Of the speakers of the said variety producing the pattern over and over, unconsciously, without any, need for formal instruction. And so being evidence of this being natural, being part of, a linguistic community's way of speaking, right? But again, even when this does not conform to what the standard variety determines that we do, this is not less grammatical, systematic, valid as the standard. The thing is that when using and knowing the standard, we have access to situations that we want to have access to. So we take, an additive approach to language varieties. We study the standard, we use the standard, but we also acknowledge, respect, use our speakers of the non-standard varieties of the language we're members, speakers of. Some usages do not conform with educated, meaning standard conventions, but we must acknowledge that the conventions associated with the standard, right, are still part of human behavior, in as much as there are conventions for us to dress in a specific way, for us to drive our cars, in a specific way. So the conventions of human behavior are not all determined by logic and reason. There's nothing implicitly good or implicitly wrong about a variety. There's simply a convention to assume that when in a specific context, it's better for us to use one form instead of another. But it's simply a convention, not a biological given. Just as the vocabulary of every language is distinct and peculiar, so is the grammar of a language. So labels, such as indicative versus subjunctive, such as accusative versus dative versus ablative, right? These are labels, right, that may be of use, more of use in specific languages than others. So to speak of, say, the existence of different types of mood, indicative and subjunctive, is of use in the two languages that we use. For we in English and in Spanish can profit from the division of verbal forms, finite verbal forms, in them showing, in them representing indicative or subjunctive mood. For the distinction is actual, is present in the two languages. But perhaps it is not so frequent to have a division such as accusative, dative, ablative, to use these labels, in the two languages in the same way. For They come from Latin, in which we have different inflections for pronouns and nouns depending on the role in the sentence that these pronouns and nouns perform. Perhaps in English and Spanish, they're not so, they do not make as much sense as they used to make in Latin, or they make in Latin. And still, we see them used in the different grammar books about English and Spanish. But the point is, it might be the case that we find some labels that are more relevant in some language than in some other language. And still, we are taught that the labels ought to be used irrespective of the language anytime we speak of a specific pronoun performing a specific function in a sentence. We must, move with caution in this respect, because we are students, of the grammar of the languages that we work with, and we want to be, aware of the existence of these distinctions. But perhaps we won't, end up using these distinctions if we are not translators, linguists, English, Spanish teachers, but are rather, engineers, mathematicians, cooks, and you name it, any other profession. So there's no point in having distinct labels if grammatical distinctions are made differently across languages. This is valid particularly for those who don't study languages. For us who do, well, let's acknowledge that some labels are more useful in some languages than some others, but still I suggest that if you come across these labels, at least wonder what they mean or what they used to refer to when they were, created, and what application you may have to the usage of such labels today in the specific, context of ours. In this specific case, the study of the contrasts that exist between Spanish and English. Thank you very much.